Historians restored a 19th century portrait found in a barn. What appeared behind left them silent. The barn had stood empty for 40 years, leaning slightly to the left like an old man tired of standing. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a conservator from the Richmond Museum of Art, stepped carefully over rotting floorboards, her flashlight cutting through the September dust. She had driven 3 hours into rural Virginia, following a phone call from an estate lawyer settling the property of the deceased owner, a reclusive antiquarian named Thomas Whitmore. Most of it's junk, the lawyer had warned, but he mentioned something about a Civil War portrait in his notes. Elena found it leaning against the back wall, wrapped in moth-eaten canvas. When she pulled the fabric away, her breath caught. The portrait measured roughly 2 feet by 30 inches, oil on canvas, darkened by more than a century and a half of grime and oxidized varnish. The subject was a young woman, perhaps 22 or 23, seated in a high-backed chair. Her dark hair was pulled severely back, and she wore a deep green dress with a high collar, modest, proper, entirely unremarkable for 1862. But something felt wrong. Elena had restored hundreds of portraits from this period, and she had learned to read the small inconsistencies that whispered of alterations, of secrets painted over. The woman's hands rested in her lap, but the fabric of her dress seemed oddly thick in places, the brushwork uneven. The background, too dark and flat, suggested overzealous repainting. She photographed the portrait from every angle, then carefully loaded it into her van. As she drove back toward Richmond, the young woman's eyes seemed to follow her in the rearview mirror, patient and waiting, as if she had been waiting for 162 years to finally tell her story. Elena's conservation studio occupied the 3rd floor of a converted tobacco warehouse near the James River. Morning light poured through tall windows as she positioned the portrait on her examination table. Her assistant, Marcus Chen, a doctoral student specializing in Civil War-era art, leaned in with interest. "The frame is original oak, definitely 1860s, Marcus observed, running gloved fingers along the carved edge. "But look at this." He pointed to the bottom right corner, where a brass plate had been removed, leaving tiny nail holes and a faint rectangular outline in the wood. Elena nodded, already setting up her digital microscope. Someone wanted to erase the identification. That's not uncommon when families were ashamed of a relative's choices or circumstances. She adjusted the lighting and began photographing the surface at high magnification, section by section. The woman in the portrait had a delicate face, neither beautiful nor plain, but her expression was what held Elena's attention. Most Victorian portraits showed subjects with neutral, almost blank expressions. Photography required long exposures, and painters followed the convention. But this woman's eyes held something else. Determination, defiance, perhaps, or grief barely contained. "The signature is illegible," Marcus said, examining the lower left corner. "Water damage maybe, or deliberately obscured." Elena switched to raking light, angling the lamp to cast shadows across the surface. Immediately, the texture of the paint revealed itself, smooth in some areas, heavily built up in others. "There's definitely overpainting here," she murmured, tracing the woman's dress with her finger above the canvas. "See how the green is actually layered over something darker? And her hands—" She stopped, leaning closer. In the harsh angled light, she could see it clearly. The shape of the hands beneath didn't quite match the hands painted on top. Something had been hidden, deliberately, carefully, and someone had paid good money to keep it hidden. The X-ray fluorescence scanner arrived on Tuesday morning, a bulky machine on loan from the Conservation Department at Virginia Commonwealth University. Elena had called in a favor from Dr. Patricia Hammond, a materials scientist who specialized in analyzing historical paintings. Together, they carefully positioned the portrait under the scanner's sensor array. "This will show us the elemental composition of the paint layers," Patricia explained to Marcus, who was documenting everything with his camera. "Different pigments contain different metals and compounds. Lead white, iron oxide, copper-based greens, each has a distinct signature. If there's overpainting, we'll see where the chemical compositions don't match the visible surface." The scan took 3 hours. Elena watched the data appear on Patricia's laptop screen, false color images that revealed what the naked eye could never see. And there it was, unmistakable. Beneath the prim green dress, another image emerged in ghostly outline. "My God," Patricia whispered. The original painting showed the same young woman, but instead of the modest Victorian gown, she wore a dark apron. And across the apron, invisible for more than 160 years, were stains, dozens of them, concentrated around the midsection and sleeves. The chemical signature was unmistakable. Iron oxide, but not the pigment kind. This was organic iron, the signature of old blood. Marcus's hand trembled as he zoomed in on the scan. Her hands, too. Look at her hands. Beneath the carefully painted, clean hands resting demurely in her lap, the scan revealed the original. Hands held palm up, stained to the wrists, captured in brutal honesty by an artist who had painted what he saw before someone, family perhaps, or executors of an estate, paid to have the truth buried under prettier lies. Elena felt her throat tighten. This was no longer just a portrait. This was evidence of a life deliberately erased. Elena couldn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, the X-ray images glowing in the darkness, and began to dig. The portrait had come from Thomas Whitmore's estate, but who had he acquired it from? The lawyer had mentioned that Whitmore collected Civil War memorabilia obsessively but kept almost no records of provenance. She started with property records. Whitmore had purchased the farm in 1981 from the estate of Margaret Dawson, whose family had owned the land since 1847. Elena found Margaret's obituary in the County Historical Society's archives. Survived by no children, last of the Dawson line, the Dawson family. Elena typed the name into genealogical databases, census records, Civil War rosters. Nothing immediately connected to a young woman who would have been portrait age in 1862. But then, women were rarely documented with the same detail as men in that era. Marcus arrived at her studio the next morning with coffee and news. "I found something. Look at this." He opened his laptop to a digitized page from the Richmond Dispatch, dated April 1863. The headline read, "Local family mourns, daughter lost to typhoid." The brief obituary mentioned Catherine Dawson, age 23, who had succumbed to fever after selflessly attending to the sick. The phrasing was standard Victorian euphemism, but one line caught Elena's attention. Her family requests privacy during this difficult time and asks that no further inquiries be made regarding the circumstances of her final days. "That's odd," Marcus said. "Why would they need to specify no further inquiries unless there was something to inquire about?" Elena pulled up the X-ray image again, studying Catherine's face. Because she wasn't sick at home in bed like a proper young lady. She was somewhere else, doing something her family considered shameful. A hospital? Maybe. Or a field hospital. Or, Elena paused, a chill running down her spine. Marcus, what if she wasn't a patient at all? The Virginia Historical Society's archive smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals. Elena had requested access to their Civil War medical records, a vast and largely unorganized collection of documents, letters, and rosters that few researchers had fully examined. She and Marcus sat at a wooden table under fluorescent lights, surrounded by acid-free boxes filled with the fragmented memories of war. Most female nurses during the Civil War were either nuns or upper-class women like Dorothea Dix's recruits, Marcus said, flipping through a roster. But there were others. Untrained women who just showed up at field hospitals and started helping. The Army didn't officially recognize them, so they're barely documented. Elena opened a box labeled Chimborazo Hospital, Miscellaneous Correspondence, 1862-1863. Chimborazo, on the outskirts of Richmond, had been the Confederacy's largest military hospital, a sprawling complex of wards that treated more than 76,000 soldiers. She pulled out brittle letters, most written by surgeons requesting supplies or reporting casualty numbers. Then, 40 minutes into her search, she found it. A letter dated November 1862, written by a doctor, James Thornton, to the hospital's chief surgeon. The handwriting was barely legible, hasty, and frustrated. "I must once again protest the presence of Miss D in the surgical ward. While her dedication is admirable, her insistence on remaining during amputations and assisting with the most gruesome procedures is unseemly for a woman of her station. I have requested that she limit herself to bandaging and feeding patients, but she refuses to comply. Her family has been notified, but she continues to return. If she contracts infection, as seems inevitable, the responsibility will not fall upon this hospital. Miss D. Catherine Dawson." Elena's hands trembled as she photographed the letter. Marcus read over her shoulder and let out a long breath. She wasn't just nursing, she was operating, or assisting in operations. In 1862, that would have been absolutely forbidden for a woman, Elena said softly, especially a woman from a respectable family. With Catherine's identity confirmed, Elena began the delicate process of removing the overpaint. Using microscopic amounts of solvent on cotton swabs no bigger than a pencil tip, she worked millimeter by millimeter, revealing what had been hidden beneath. It would take weeks, perhaps months, to fully restore the original image without damaging the underlying paint. But even partial restoration was revealing. As the false green dress dissolved away, the dark apron emerged. Coarse fabric, practical rather than decorative. The bloodstains were rendered with careful, almost clinical precision. This artist hadn't romanticized or minimized what he'd seen. He had painted Catherine exactly as she was, a young woman elbow-deep in the carnage of war. Marcus discovered more records at the Library of Virginia. Catherine Dawson had been born in 1839 to William and Margaret Dawson, a prosperous family who owned a small plantation. Though plantation meant something different in Virginia than in the Deep South. The Dawsons had owned 4 enslaved people in 1860, according to census records, which made them relatively modest slaveholders by Virginia standards. Catherine had never married. No records suggested engagement or courtship. Instead, there was a gap in the documentation. She appeared in the 1860 census living at home, and then nothing until the death notice in 1863. What happened to her in those 3 years? Marcus wondered aloud. Elena was studying the portrait again, this time focusing on Catherine's expression. Now that she knew who this woman was, she could read more in those dark eyes. This wasn't shame or grief. This was defiance. Catherine had known exactly what she was doing when she sat for this portrait. She had chosen to be painted in her bloodied apron, hands stained, the truth of her work visible for anyone willing to look. Someone had commissioned this portrait, probably Catherine herself, and then someone else, her family most likely, had paid to have it altered, to transform their scandalous daughter into a respectable Victorian lady. But Catherine had outlasted them all. The truth had waited beneath the lies, patient and persistent. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus had posted about the discovery on a Civil War genealogy forum, and within days he received an email from a woman named Jennifer Hartley in North Carolina. She claimed to be researching the Dawson family line and had something that might interest them. They met at a coffee shop near the university. Jennifer was in her 60s, a retired school teacher with careful handwriting and a leather portfolio filled with photocopied documents. "My great-great-grandmother was Catherine's cousin," she explained, laying papers on the table. The families stayed in touch through letters. Most were lost, but these survived. Elena read the first letter, dated October 1862, written by Catherine to her cousin Lucy. The handwriting was educated, confident. "Dearest Lucy, you ask why I continue at Chimborazo when Mama and Papa beg me to cease. I cannot explain it in words that would satisfy anyone who has not seen what I have seen. Yesterday a boy, he could not have been 17, was brought to us with both legs shattered by artillery. Dr. Thornton said the wounds were too severe, that we should let him die comfortably with morphine. But I insisted we try. We amputated above the knee on both sides. It took 4 hours. He survived the surgery, Lucy. He opened his eyes this morning and asked for water. How could I not be here for that? How could I return to embroidery and calling cards when I know what these hands can do?" Elena felt tears prick her eyes. Jennifer laid down another letter, this one from Catherine's mother to Lucy's mother, dated January 1863. "We are beside ourselves. Catherine refuses to come home. She has contracted some manner of illness. The hospital will not say precisely what, but we suspect typhoid. They say she insisted on continuing her work even when feverish. William has sent a carriage, but she will not leave the patients. She says they need her. I do not know what we have done to deserve such a stubborn, willful daughter." The final letter was brief, from Catherine herself, dated March 1863, her handwriting shaky. "Lucy, if you receive this, please know I do not regret a single moment. Tell my family I loved them, but I could not be who they wanted me to be. I have saved lives here. That will have to be enough." She died 3 weeks later. She was 23 years old. Elena knew that understanding who had painted the original portrait was crucial to understanding Catherine's story. Victorian portraiture was formulaic. Most painters followed strict conventions, softening features and poses to create idealized images. But whoever had painted Catherine's portrait had broken every rule, capturing brutal reality instead of comfortable fiction. The signature in the lower corner remained stubbornly illegible even under magnification, but Elena noticed something she'd missed before. Tiny initials carved into the wooden stretcher frame that supported the canvas from behind. She carefully removed the backing paper and found them. W.H. 1863. Marcus spent 3 days cross-referencing lists of artists active in Richmond during the war. Finally, he found a match. William Hammond, a painter who had worked primarily as a medical illustrator for Confederate surgeons, documenting injuries and surgical procedures for training purposes. They found his advertisement in an 1862 Richmond newspaper. Accurate medical illustration. Surgical procedures documented for educational use. Portraiture also available. That's why the blood looks so real, Elena breathed. He was used to painting surgical scenes. He painted Catherine the same way he'd paint an amputation or a field dressing, with clinical accuracy. Further research revealed that Hammond had been hired by Chimborazo Hospital in 1861 to create a visual record of surgical techniques. He would have seen Catherine working. He would have witnessed her assisting in operations, seen her covered in blood, watched her refuse to leave even when physicians ordered her away. The portrait hadn't been commissioned by Catherine's family. Elena found the payment record in Hammond's account book, preserved by the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Portrait Miss C.D., commissioned by subject herself, paid in full, March 1863. Catherine had paid for her own portrait. She had insisted on being painted exactly as she was. And then, after her death, her family had hired someone else to paint over the truth, to transform their embarrassing daughter into someone they could mourn publicly without shame. But Catherine had chosen her truth, and it had survived. It took Elena 6 weeks to fully remove the overpaint and stabilize the original image. She worked with infinite patience, revealing Catherine inch by inch, the bloodied apron, the stained hands, the exhausted determination in her face. The portrait emerged like a resurrection, a woman stepping out of imposed invisibility back into the light. When the restoration was complete, Elena stood back and looked at Catherine Dawson as she had been in March 1863, weeks before her death. The portrait was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was stark, unflinching, even harsh. But it was true. Marcus had continued researching Catherine's work at Chimborazo. He found surgical logs that mentioned Miss D, assisting with dozens of operations between September 1862 and March 1863. He found a note from a recovering soldier, written to his sister, mentioning, "A young lady who held my hand during the amputation and told me I was brave enough to survive." He found a requisition form where Catherine had personally purchased morphine and bandages with her own money when supplies ran low. She saved lives, Marcus said quietly, standing beside Elena in front of the restored portrait. Real documented lives, and her family erased her for it. Jennifer Hartley had helped them track down Catherine's grave in a small family cemetery outside Richmond. It was marked with a simple stone, Catherine Dawson, 1839-1863, beloved daughter. Nothing about her work, nothing about who she really was. Elena made a decision. The Richmond Museum would exhibit the portrait, but not as just another Civil War artifact. They would tell Catherine's complete story, the original painting, the X-ray images showing what had been hidden, the letters, the surgical logs, the truth of a woman who had defied every expectation of her time and gender. The exhibit would be called Unveiled, The Hidden Life of Catherine Dawson. And this time, no one would be able to look away. The exhibition opened on a cold November morning in 2024, exactly 161 years after Catherine's death. Elena stood in the gallery as visitors entered, watching their faces as they encountered the portrait and the story surrounding it. The room was designed to take visitors through Catherine's journey, from the painted-over version her family had created, through the X-ray images that revealed the truth, to the fully restored original portrait centered on the wall. Beside it hung enlarged reproductions of Catherine's letters, the surgical logs, and Hammond's account book. On a screen, a short documentary played, featuring Elena and Marcus explaining the restoration process and historians contextualizing Catherine's work within the broader story of women in Civil War medicine. Jennifer Hartley attended the opening with 12 members of the extended Dawson family, descendants of Catherine's cousins who had kept her memory alive in whispered stories and saved letters. One of them, a young woman named Sarah, stood before the portrait for a long time, tears streaming down her face. "We always knew there was something," she told Elena. Family stories about an ancestor who did something scandalous during the war. But no one knew exactly what. They just said she was difficult and willful and that she'd embarrassed the family. Now we know. She was a hero. The Washington Post ran a feature about the discovery. NPR interviewed Elena for Morning Edition. The story spread across social media. A woman literally painted out of history, brought back to light by modern technology and persistent research. But for Elena, the most meaningful moment came 3 weeks after the opening, when a medical student from Virginia Commonwealth University stopped her in the gallery. The young woman, who wore scrubs under her winter coat, looked at Catherine's portrait with recognition in her eyes. "She looks like she just finished a 12-hour shift in the ER," the student said softly. "That exhaustion, that determination, I see it in the mirror every night." Elena smiled. "She'd be glad to know you see it. That's exactly what she wanted, to be seen as she really was." Catherine Dawson had been buried in shame, erased by her family, forgotten by history, but her portrait had outlasted all of them. And now, 161 years later, she stood revealed, hands bloodied, apron stained, eyes fierce with purpose. Not a proper Victorian lady, not a daughter who had obeyed, a healer, a rebel, a woman who had saved lives and refused to apologize for it. The truth had been painted over, but it could not be destroyed. And when historians finally looked closely enough, when they zoomed in past the lies and examined what lay beneath, Catherine spoke again, silent but unmistakable, waiting patiently through more than a century of darkness to finally tell her story. And this time, everyone was listening.